Oh, hello, everybody, and welcome to the Saturday stream of Adam's Music Box. Well, yesterday we heard that at the age of 82, John Lodge of the Moody Blues had died, and this one hit me rather hard. I mean, 82 is it's a long life, but the Moody Blues were one of the very first bands that I fell in love with. When I heard Nights in White Satin on a car radio and was explained that the thing going on at the end, the narration, was a poem, I started writing poetry. And I obviously was playing my drums along with all of their albums in the early days. I knew all of the great seven original sort of golden era, let's call them Moody Blues albums, back to front, knew every chord change, every lyric, every each one of those great album covers is just emblazed upon my mind. And they were one of my favorite bands of all time. But I want to say, and I mean it, that objectively, pardon me, the Moody Blues were one of the most important, most original, and best bands of all time. They came out in a 60s era when the world of popular music was shifting between one that was dominated by the musical idiom of sort of watered down jazz and Broadway style show tunes to one in which the language of pop music, the idiom of pop music, became rock and roll. But not content to just be any old rock and roll band, complete with a singer, the Moody Blues created a sound that was theirs, and no one has really been able to duplicate it. Few have ever tried. There was literally nothing like it before and nothing like it since. Now, the core three members of the real original Moody Blues were on keyboards, Mike Pinder, on drums, Graham Edge, and on flute, vocals, and percussion, Ray Thomas. And those three men formed the core of the original Moody Blues. Denny Lane, who would later go on to find a lot of success with Wings, was the original lead singer, and a man called Clint Warwick was the original bass player. That lineup released one album called The Magnificent Moodies, and that had a rather successful single, Go Now, sung by Denny Lane. But that proved to be short lived, and that sort of prototypical rock pop beat, as they called it at the time, style, that proved to be short lived by the Moody Blues, and their golden era would come only a few years later. Pinder, Edge, and Thomas decided to invite two new members into the band, and this proved to change everything. They were two great songwriters, two great musicians, two great vocalists, and yes, they could and did harmonize with one another once they met, of course. And this was on bass, the wonderful John Lodge, and on guitar, Justin Hayward. And Hayward today is the only member of the Moody Blues who is still around, which is pretty shocking. I mean, Pat Moraz is alive, of course, and well, but I don't, as much as I think he's a great musician, I don't consider him ever a member of the Moody Blues. There was actually a lawsuit about that. But anyway, in 1966, Hayward and Lodge created the quintessential classic Moody Blues lineup. And they brought with them songs that were unparalleled and a vocal sensibility that worked so well with the others. I mean, even though the classic lineup didn't all form based on, people who knew each other from school or because they played together in other bands, there was such wonderful chemistry, such wonderful symbiosis between all of the members of the band in terms of their songwriting, in terms of their harmonies, even in terms of their solo vocal parts. Their voices just matched so well. It was, you could call it a match made in heaven. Now, when this lineup crystallized, the record company DRAM, which was a like a proto prog rock sub label owned by Decca, they said to the Moody Blues, "We want you to do a rock and roll version of Dvorak's Ninth Symphony, his New World Symphony." And they said, "Screw that. We want to write our own symphonic rock album." And they most certainly did. And that album became what I consider, and although some might disagree, I consider it the first true progressive rock album and the first true symphonic rock album. And this was, of course, 1967's Days of Future Past. It's an album that was, it set the standard and it set the template for all future Moody Blues albums. They were conceptual, musical. They took you on a musical journey. Some would say even on a spiritual journey. The songs, though, were memorable. They were well written. The soundscape was completely unique. And of course, while every song on Days of Future Past was beautiful, Tuesday Afternoon, co written by John Lodge, and Nights in White Satin, which was obviously arranged by the whole band, those were the huge singles. Now, Lodge and Hayward were essentially the co-frontmen of the band, but everyone in the band was really incredibly important, and they all had unique songwriting styles. Hayward was the most overtly romantic. Lodge had, I would say, an equally power romanticism plus a kind of contemplative style. His songs were the deepest. Ray Thomas had the bucolic songs and sometimes the cosmic songs. Mike Pinder was pure cosmic, sometimes theological, and Graham Edge was obviously the one who provided a lot of the conceptual material and the wonderful narrations to Pinder's poetry. And when you put all of that together, you really get a band of multiple distinct talents all working so well together. Now, what made the Moody Blues sound immediately different than every other band in the world? Well, this would be the mellotron. You could argue that while some bands had lead guitar, some bands like The Nice had lead organ, others had lead piano. The Who had lead bass, I would argue. The Moody Blues had lead mellotron. Now, the mellotron, for those who don't know, is sometimes referred to as the world's first sampler, and it was, of course, based on an earlier instrument called the Chamberlin. The way it worked is that there was a keyboard instrument, kind of looked like an organ, the early models, the Mark II, and in it were lots of quarter-inch tapes. And on those tapes were most of the well-known instruments playing every note of the scale. So there were obviously a lot of tapes in there. There were violin sounds, solo violin, a violin section, a brass section, a trumpet sound, a guitar sound, percussion sounds. Again, like a sampler, but, digital technology wasn't really around. It was being developed at the time. And so it relied on tapes. You would press a key down on the keyboard and a tape head would come into contact with the tape and play these sampled sounds. And it was a notoriously difficult instrument to maintain for most, but not for the Moody Blues. And the reason for this is that Mike Pinder actually worked at the Mellotron factory. He could assemble and disassemble a Mellotron like the fastest gun in the West, or the Midlands, as it were, of England, where the Mellotron was made. The Chamberlin was an American instrument shipped to England, and a company called Mellotron sort of reworked it. And that was the version that conquered the world of music. So while lots of bands use the mellotron both in the studio and on the road, the Moody Blues were the only band to really be able to use it with total consistency, because the man playing it could also repair it, and heaven knows it needed the repairs. Although Pinder insists it wasn't as unreliable as others made it out to be. They just didn't know how to use it. Now, Days of Future Past, a huge hit. And like I said, this created the template for future Moody Blues albums, and they wasted no time. In 1968, they came out with In Search of the Lost Chord, a wonderful album. You had so many great songs. It started off with a John Lodge classic, Ride My Seesaw. It had Dr. Livingston, I presume, as well as Legend of the Mind, psychedelic stuff from Ray Thomas, House of Four Doors, a deeply contemplative one from Lodge, the very romantic Voices in the Sky, different than the Motorhead version by Justin Hayward, The Best Way to Travel, a cosmic one from Pinder. Just a great album. So for those who might have expected the Moody Blues to become one album wonders because there's no way to top Days of Future Past, the Moody Blues proved that they were on a real generational run at the time. And of course, this continued with two albums released in 1969. First was On the Threshold of a Dream. Wonderful, wonderful album. So many great songs. Never Comes the Day, Have You Heard, The Dream, Dear Diary, Send Me No Wine, To Share Our Love, So Deep Within You. So many great classics. Lovely to See You, the full opening track after the intro. Wonderful. And that same year they came out with, and this one's a bit of a mouthful, To Our Children's 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 Children. Does that make grandchildren or great grandchildren? I don't know. But what I do know is that it was another wonderful album. And it had some great John Lodge numbers, particularly Candle of Life, one of the best Moody Blues songs ever. It wasn't a single, something of a deep album cut, but one of the best Moody Blues songs, and it happens to be a John Lodge composition, as was Eyes of the Child, another great John Lodge composition. So many other great songs too. Eternity Road, a great one by Ray Thomas. Gypsy of a Strange and Distant Time, that became a show opener, a great song by Justin Hayward. And like I said, they were in their full stride. I mean, they were in their full stride really from Days of Future Past through to In Search of the Lost Chord and On the Threshold of a Dream and right through to this album. Absolutely incredible. And then came the 70s, and they didn't lose a beat. They came out with A Question of Balance and the song Question, another great showstopper. Tortoise and Hare, a beautiful one by John Lodge. Melancholy Man, one of the great introspective numbers from Mike Pinder. So many great songs with the Mellotron obviously doing its thing. Wonderful stuff. 1971, again, Every Good Boy Deserves Favor. That's something that pianists will understand. It's a way to remember the notes on the piano. And this had another huge single, The Story in Your Eyes, a Justin Hayward number, a song that John Lodge wrote about his daughter Emily called Emily's Song. Nice to Be Here, a great one from Thomas. One More Time to Live, a beautiful one from Lodge. The album finishes with My Song, a great one from Mike Pinder. And then came 1972, which was the final album from the classic Moody Blues lineup. And this was Seventh Sojourn. Now, this contained my favorite Moody Blues song of all, Isn't Life Strange? It was written by John Lodge, sung by John Lodge, with both overdubbed harmonies and vocals from the other members of the band. And it's just a rock'em sock'em, beautiful, contemplative, powerful, romantic but not sentimental, wonderful, wonderful song. And side two also rounded out with another John Lodge song that happened to be another one of the band's very biggest singles, and this was I'm Just a Singer in a Rock and Roll Band. The whole album, though, really great. When You're a Free Man, the penultimate song by Mike Pinder, absolutely beautiful. You and Me, a great song co-written by Graham Edge and Justin Hayward. Lost in a Lost World opened it up with Mike Pinder. Just all the whole album so very good. And then the Moody Blues decided to take a break. But just a few years later, in 1975, there was an album that I sort of consider a lost album of the Moody Blues. Not that it was lost in a real sense, it was, in fact, very popular, but it wasn't technically a Moody Blues album. It was a collaboration between Justin Hayward and John Lodge, and the album was called Blue Jays. Such a good album, frankly, as good as the great Moody Blues albums. The penultimate song on this album, which happens to be my favorite on the album, is a real sort of gut wrenching, heart pounding, call it what you will, song called Maybe by John Lodge. And what a wonderful song. That and Isn't Life Strange, to me, are sort of the best examples of your contemplative yet romantic John Lodge writing style. And of course, members of the band collaborated on writing. They wrote well together, they sung well together, until Pat Moraz joined pseudo joined in the 80s. They were really a low drama band, and John Lodge himself credited this personally to his deep faith. He was deeply Christian, never talked about it too much in public, although he had mentioned it on some interviews. And he later said, I think, quite accurately, that his faith was able to shelter him from some of the sort of excesses and craziness that went along with the rock and roll lifestyle. But Blue Jays is just such a great album. Absolutely marvelous stuff. And the late 70s also had some other members of the Moody Blues, in fact, most of them creating solo albums, because the band was sort of, pardon me, they weren't broken up, but they were a bit on hiatus. So in 77, you have Natural Avenue, a John Lodge solo album. That same year, you have Songwriter, a solo album by Justin Hayward. And in 1980, you had the other Justin Hayward album of that period called Night Flight, Graham Edge had his own band and he released quite a few songs. He had some interesting members of his band, including the Gervitz brothers at one point, who were playing slightly earlier in the 70s with Ginger Baker. Check out Kick Off Your Muddy Boots from 1975 and Paradise Ballroom from 77 from the Graham Edge band, again with the Gervitz brothers. Really great stuff. And Ray Thomas didn't get left out either. His bucolic album from 78 featuring Nicky James from Mighty Oaks. And then the following year, he did another solo album, Hopes, Wishes, and Dreams. Mike Pinder, of course, released his first album around the same time as well. And this one was released in 76 called The Promise. And he would release another cosmic one in 94 called, I think, Among the Stars, if memory serves me right. Now, the Moody Blues did reform in 1978, but Pinder, halfway through the attempt to record an album, decided to leave. And this did change the sound of the Moody Blues because gone was the mellotron, but the two principal songwriters, Lodge and Hayward, continued to go strong, and the album Octave proved to be a rather unexpectedly successful reunion album that had a few hits. It had Driftwood, which was a minor hit, Stepping in a Slide Zone, another John Lodge track, which kicked off the album, and people knew that the Moody Blues were back. In the 80s, they very much modernized their sound. They brought in the sequencers, samplers, drum machines, electronic drums, modern synthesizers, and it obviously sounded very different than the soundscape that was painted with Mike Pinder's Mellotron, but the core of the singing and songwriting remained the same. And 1981's The Voyager, which launched this new period, had loads of hits. It had The Voice, Talking Out of Turn, Gemini Dream, a song co-written by Hayward and Lodge. You had 22,000 Days by Graham Edge, and the very cosmic, tongue-in-cheek veteran cosmic rocker by Ray Thomas. And this sort of success with their new 80s sound, which now featured keyboardist Patrick Moraz, a real virtuoso who had played with Refugee, which was a nice subsidiary, if you will. When Keith Emerson left the Nice, they became Refugee with Patrick Moraz. Patrick also played on Yes's Relayer album, the most jazzy of all the Yes albums, and he had a great sort of jazz fusion album himself in the mid-70s called The Story of One, sometimes referred to as The Story of I, but it's a Roman numeral one. In 83, like I said, the Moody Blues continued with another very successful album called The Present, Blue World, and Sitting at the Wheel. Sitting at the Wheel being another great John Lodge song. Those were two pretty big singles from that album. And then another huge hit of an album in 1986, you had The Other Side of Life. The title track was a big hit, as was Your Wildest Dreams. Prelude, or pardon me, that was what do you call it? An early compilation, but Sur la Mer sort of rounded out the 80s era in 1988. And that had Here Comes the Weekend by John Lodge as a single, and I Know You're Out There Somewhere, a single by Justin Hayward. They slowed down a lot in the 90s in terms of their recording, although in the very early 2000s, they released a wonderful Christmas album called December, which is one of my favorite Christmas albums of all time. But even though they were pulling back their time in the studio, they were really, really increasing their presence on the road, because by now, touring with orchestras had become more cost effective. People, sound engineers by the 90s and early 2000s had figured out how to mic orchestras in a way where a rock band wouldn't overpower them in terms of the final front of house mix. And so they did a lot of concerts with orchestras, and of course lots of tours without, having various keyboardists as sidemen over the years, without filling Mike Pinder's shoes with anyone permanent after the lawsuit with Pat Moraz. If you're ever really bored, by the way, you can watch the courtroom drama between Patrick Moraz and the rest of the Moody Blues, because when he was fired from the band for having an attitude problem, which It's kind of well known about him. He sued, saying that he's a member of the band who cannot be fired. He's not a sideman. He was asking for a lot of money, and the whole thing was on video. It was live on court TV. This was, this was before OJ, but it was similarly popular because it was a celebrity trial. And while Mraz won, the jury didn't really like him, so they gave him like a minor fraction of what he was asking for, and that was the last time the Moody Blues appeared in court. Normally, I wouldn't consider compilation albums very relevant, but the Moody Blues came out with one of the more interesting compilation albums of all time. From 1974, it was called This Is the Moody Blues. And the songs were edited in such a way so that they all faded in and out of each other. In other words, much like a concept album where there are no hard breaks between the tracks, the compilation album, This Is the Moody Blues, was sort of a concept album in and of itself. Some various different mixes of the songs were used. You need a keen ear to pick out some of the differences, but if you're a huge Moody Blues fan, once you hear those differences, you can't unhear them, making This Is the Moody Blues a huge collector's item. They had some more mundane, like I said, Prelude and a few other compilation albums later on, but this one really was a work of art. It was really a statement saying, these are the songs that we feel are most representative of our golden era 7 albums, and we're going to edit and arrange them in such a way that even though they weren't designed to be a cohesive unit and they were written years apart in most cases, we as the Moody Blues can turn it into a cohesive unit. And I do believe that album is still available on your Spotify's and your Whatify's and all the rest of it. Let me double check that for you, because it is, as compilation albums go, it is probably the most interesting of all time. So let me see if that is still on there. Give me a second. Do-do-do-do-do. Yes, it is. And I will copy the Spotify link into the chat right now because it's Spotify, for whatever reason, is kind of trying to hide it. So let me put that into the chat. Let me see if I can actually put that in the description. I can. So just give me a second to copy that in. YouTube will probably ban the video now because Spotify is owned by a different company, but we won't let that get us down. So yeah, the legacy of the Moody Blues. In my view, the Moody Blues are one of the most important. It's live TV, folks, and it's that season where all the crap is in the air. Well, every season is crap in the air, but I suppose it's a bit crappier at this time of year. Anyway, the Moody Blues, as I was saying, one of the most important bands of all time. I'll start with why that's the case for me personally. A lot of people had the Stones and the Beatles. Other generations, had your Metallicas and your Guns N' Roses. Others yet might have had either Led Zeppelin or the Doobie Brothers. And all of those bands I mentioned are great. I like many of them. But for me, the Moody Blues is really what opened up the door for rock music and rock tinged pop music that was something more, something beyond. The chords were deeper, the arrangements more orchestral, the sounds more novel and exciting with the mellotron, the lyrics more poetic and meaningful, the harmonies richer, the messages more profound, the essence of a concept album so modern. And to me, I was hooked straight away. And I would argue that because of what the Moody Blues did so early on, beginning in 67 and 68, they really created progressive rock. Others were right there doing things that helped create the genre. Procol Harum's first album, Pink Floyd's Piper at the Gates of Dawn, in a very different way, created a kind of prog, things that, yes, of course, the Beatles, Stones, and others were doing. Eric Burdon and the Animals were getting quite out there. But to me, more than anyone else, the Moody Blues created the template for the concept album within progressive rock, a genre I think, love 'em or love the genre, hate the genre, I happen to love it. I truly believe you get the Moody Blues credit for creating. I don't think you'd have a King Crimson. I don't think you'd have a Yes or a Genesis or an ELP without the Moody Blues. And for that matter, would Led Zeppelin have created progressive type of albums? Would Rush have ever found their way in Canada? Would American prog rock bands like Styx and Kansas um, and and for that matter, in many ways, Boston, American style prog rock, you could call it, or Ambrosia, West Coast style prog rock, would they have found their way without the Moody Blues? I think the Moody Blues were so deeply influential on so many levels. And that's saying something because no one really tried to copy the Moody Blues. Some claim that Barclay James Harvest did, but I would say that they were uncopyable. So their influence wasn't in the fact that people said, well, let's go out and sound like the Moody Blues, because they had that combination of songwriting, harmony, playing, and new sound, all of those skills and those attributes that you couldn't really copy. But in terms of telling people what the possibilities were, that it's okay to be more orchestral than it is to be stripped down, that it's okay to indulge in classical music and marry it to the rhythm and blues origins of rock and roll. It was not only okay to do that, but audiences end up loving it. And the Moody Blues did find universal success. They are loved everywhere. Huge, probably bigger in the US than any other market, but popular throughout Europe, popular in parts of Asia, huge global fan base. And again, when your songs stand the test of time, when that baseline composition is so good, and the songs can be played acoustically, they can be played in stripped down arrangements, they can be played with full orchestra, that passes the other test that I always have for a great song. If it can withstand being played in different settings and the greatness comes through, you've got yourself a wonderful song on your hands. And now, with only one member of the classic lineup still alive, it's just sort of a sad day that we've lost, what I consider one of the two frontmen, if you will, of that classic lineup in John Lodge. It was sad and maybe a bit scary to read. He passed away suddenly and unexpectedly, because we know what that's a euphemism for. So that's quite sad. But he was surrounded by his family, died lovingly. As a Christian, he'll have died in peace, I would think, and lots of people now praying for him. And it's the sadness is more for us because it shows that it's an end of an era, although Justin Hayward is out there touring still, and still, even at his advanced stage, he's sounding very good. So rest in peace to John Lodge, but long live the Moody Blues. I think that when a lot of other bands that the critics were more friendly to, and that some of the snobs were more in love with, when those bands lose their popularity because the songwriting and the playing just wasn't as good, people will listen to the Moody Blues and say, this is an all-time band. This was a band that created 7 albums that were absolutely perfect from start to finish, and then had a second career with great pop songs in the 80s and even into the 90s. What a wonderful band, one of the best of all time. And I think their legacy will absolutely endure for a very long time. Rest in peace, and God bless you, John Lodge. And God bless all of the Moody Blues, those with us and those that have departed. Take care.